Salad TV. Rock 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 Salad TV.
Do you recall the first time you held a piece of vinyl in your hand that you had played on? What that experience was like? Do you recall that moment? It must have been the Nas.
It was probably the Nas, maybe the Nas first single. The vinyl, that was kind of, it was an interesting, necessary part of the process. But, the real payoff is when you hear it on the radio. The first time we heard any of our music on the radio, that was when we really thought, wow, now you're in the music business.
Was it Hello, It's Me or Open My Eyes?
It was one or the other. It's funny, Open My Eyes got a little bit of airplay when it first came out, but it didn't really take off. And then somebody flipped the record and Hello, It's Me got all of the airplay after that.
Wow, that's interesting. Do you recall the back? Can you tell us the backstory behind the Face the Music? I think it's a wonderful record where you can kind of pinpoint where you're synthesizing some of the songs, but they're their own entities and they're fantastic songs. Talk a bit about the process, and was it fun doing that record?
We had a lot of fun, listing out the songs that we wanted to remind people of, but you just kind of steal the form and substitute everything else. The record had an interesting sort of genesis because immediately prior to that, I produced a couple of songs for the movie Roadie. They were a couple of Alice Cooper songs, and Utopia got an opportunity to contribute a song to the record.
I Touch You, right?
Yeah, I Just Want to Touch You. The reason why we did that is because there was this power pop movement, the knack and stuff like that. So everyone was going back to this, guitar kind of Beatley thing. And I thought, if you're going to go back to the roots, go all the way back to the roots, go back to the Beatles. So we did this Beatlesque song called I Don't Want to Touch You. And they refused to put it on the soundtrack album. And the excuse they gave, maybe they just thought it stylistically didn't fit, but the excuse they gave was they thought the Beatles would sue us. And I thought, that's silly. A silly excuse, but in any case, when somebody does something like that to us, we say, well, screw you, we're going to do a whole album of that now. And that's essentially what we did. That was the inception of the record.
How did the band react?
Oh, everybody was, we all loved the Beatles, so Chasm is just like idolized Paul McCartney the whole time, so he was in hog heaven. And it was, a fun challenge trying to be redolent of these other songs without actually literally copying anything out of them.
Well, speaking of power pop, you pretty much saved what everyone considers as one of the quintessential power pop albums is Straight Up. And you pretty much saved that record from being shelved in a sense because it wasn't done. Could you talk a bit about the backstory? And did you get a sense these guys were perhaps even better than what people positioned them for being?
Well, I was familiar with their music, but a lot of the music, there was No Matter What, and they didn't write that, So a lot of the, what's that?
Oh, you mean Come and Get It?
Come and Get It, that was it, yeah. And so some of it was like derivative in a way, quite obviously in Printer of the Beatles, they sounded a lot like the Beatles in a certain way. So they hadn't carved out like their own place yet, which may have been, the issue that they were dealing with. They finished an entire record with Jeff Emmerich, Beatles engineer, in their later recordings. And I read in Wikipedia or something like that essentially the American label scotched it. The American label says this is not what we're looking for. So George got involved. He got about halfway through the record or something like that, and he took a completely other tack, which was very much, what George was doing at the time. And and who knows what would have happened if he had finished the record, because that record, the one that he was doing, sounded just like a George Harrison record. He was doing all of that Phil Spector, big washy stuff, double overdubbing the drums and 6 acoustic guitars and stuff like that. Somewhere in there's a quartet, So when he got distracted by the Bangladesh concert business and handed the record over to me, I just kind of said, okay, we're going to start over. we have all this stuff, and we'll consider what we want to do with it, but we need to kind of start over. And they had some new songs. And so we recorded a couple of new songs. I can't remember, maybe 4 new songs. And then for the rest of it, we took like maybe 3 of what George had done and a couple of what Jeff Emmerich had done. And re-recorded some stuff so it would all sound sonically a little bit more coherent, so it didn't sound like it was coming from 3 different sessions. And I think one of the reasons why they brought me in was because I had this reputation for just like, let's not crap around anymore, let's get this done, stuff like that. I think the band was a little taken aback because they're used to all their friends being involved in making their records, so it was almost a social exercise, and having somebody come in there and say, okay, we're in the studio now, we are working now, stuff like that. And so we got through the whole thing in like about 10 days, and I took it back to, I think I mixed it in Bearsville Studios, mixed it, sent it back, and then I didn't hear anything until it was on the radio.
Were you particularly impressed with Pete as a songwriter and a musician? Pete Ham.
Oh yeah, he had, it's funny, he seemed like a very shy person, so it was like, he was not very pushy about it or aggressive about his songwriting, he just said, I have this song, and it just happened to turn out that he wrote the most commercial songs in the band. He was not the only songwriter and not the only singer. That was kind of maybe one of the confusing things about the band, and may have affected their internal dynamic, was the fact that they had an embarrassment of riches in terms of singers. Kind of like the Beatles, 3 guys who could sing lead. And they all had, Pete was kind of Paul McCartney. Tom was kind of none of them because he sang really, really high. He was almost like precursor to a heavy metal band or something like that. He had a really high voice. And Joey was kind of like, he had a slightly gravelly sort of tone, so he sounded a little bit like John. But in the end, the object was not to make them sound like the Beatles. They had to sound like something else.
Well, Baby Blue was a modest hit off the record, but it's such a gem. Did you feel vindicated years later when Breaking Bad spotlighted that and so many other people heard that song, Baby Blue?
It was funny. I wasn't a fan of Breaking Bad. I hadn't watched a lot of Breaking Bad, so I didn't watch the finale. I wasn't keeping track of it, and the next day I get all this, whoa, Baby Blue is the final thing. Do you know what that means? And I said, well, I know what it meant to Journey, when they had streetlight people at the end of The Sopranos. So
Don't Stop Believing, yeah.
Don't Stop Believing, that was it. Yeah, it was kind of a blast from the past. And it was gratifying. First thing I did is call my manager and say, we got any royalties coming out of this?
Rock Salad TV, 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 Rock Salad TV.